And in this video I'm going to talk to you about smart objects and why you should use them, especially if you're building composites and applying textures into your images. I'm also going to talk to you about embedding and linking files and textures and the difference between those. So we'll get started. I've got these two files open. Now we're just going to pop into Lightroom, and you'll see here I've got this image here of the snowdrop, and there are two ways that you can open files in Photoshop. If we right mouse click, we can go to edit and edit in Photoshop, or we can open as a smart object. Now I've opened this image as both an edit in Photoshop and a smart object, so I've got those. So we're going to go back into Photoshop, and you see here I've got the top file here which has been opened as a smart object. And how do I know that's a smart object? It's because it's got this little thumbnail here that that gets tagged onto the image when you open it. So it's opened as a layer in Photoshop there. And then the second one is just what you would normally see, which is just a flat layer in Photoshop. So let's talk a little bit about what smart objects are. Smart objects contain data about a file. There are things you can't do with them. You can't directly edit them. We can't edit the pixels on a smart object. If we actually double click this little thumbnail here, what will open up is it's basically the camera raw editor that opens up for us, and you'll see here that what's happened is it's carried through the edits that I applied in Lightroom. So with a smart object we can go back and change those edits, so it's like a non-destructive editing workflow. So we can make those changes and then apply them within the smart object. Now obviously if we wanted to do that in this image, we'd usually have to either create a new background layer, and then we'd go in and make the changes. And obviously we can build up the layers like we normally do, adding adjustment layers to do that. So let's go back to the smart object layer. Now let's say for instance we wanted to add, let's say a simple lightning vignette to this. We can go in, we can use the vignette tool or the oval select tool in the, I usually tend to use this rather than using the vignette tool, and this is one obviously that I've played with before. Let's just take it back to where it was. So I'm just going to put a lighter vignette around the outside of this image and click OK, and that's going to apply that vignette on there. So you can see how that applies in this image. It'd be a lot more complicated to create a vignette unless I've got an action to do it. It'd be a bit more complicated to do that in a general layer. I'd probably pull that back into Lightroom and do it from there. But a lot of people aren't using Lightroom. I've also had a look to see whether we can open a smart object straight from Bridge or from the hard drive, and I don't think you can. Now if you want to, you can promote an image to become a smart object. And we do that by going up here to filter and convert to smart filters. And I'm going to explain to you further on in the video as to why it's a good advantage to do that. So we just click on convert to smart filters, and it'll go off and it will convert the image or convert the layer. And there we can see it's converted the layer, and now it's got that little thumbnail icon on the bottom there. Now if I want to now open this in camera raw, I need to go back to the filter options, and I need to tell it I want it to open it in camera raw. So that'd be a Shift Control A on a PC, or just click the option here. And what that will do is it will open this as in camera raw. Now it's not got the same, it's not the same as opening it direct from Lightroom. But we can make some changes and do the same things on that we did on the previous one. So that's how we'd use it, using a smart filter and promoting an image to a smart object. Now I'm just going to delete that layer for now, because I don't need it. Just to show, that was just to show you how you can create a smart object from that. And I'm going to tell you some advantages of smart objects further down the line. But there's things you can't do with smart objects. Let's go back to that image. Because the smart object just holds data, it doesn't. We can't actually make edits to the image in the same way as we can to a flat file image. If let's just create another layer here. If I want to make some, let's say some clone changes, I want to clone some changes on here. Anything that is editing at pixel level, so that might be cloning, it might be content aware fills, it might be dodging and burning. I can't do that on a smart object because I need to be able to sample pixels. Now, if I was doing a clone on this image, which remember is the flat image, I'd just pick up the clone tool, created a layer here, which we'll call clone layer, so that we make it into a little bit more of a non-destructive process. And I'll do the normal thing when I want to sample clone, use the Alt key to sample the area I want to clone, and then obviously just do the dragging and cloning the various areas the way that I want to do it. And that's fine. We switch on and off and you can see those are the cloned areas. Now, if I try to do this on a smart object, let's see what happens. So I've got the clone tool already selected here, and you'll see I've got this little stop symbol, and I'm not sure what you'd call it. Now, if I click Alt to do the selection, it looks as if it's going to select the area for me, which I will do. But then when I try to clone on this area here, you'll see what happens. It says this smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Edit contents will no longer be available. Rasterize the smart object. Now we're going to cancel that because we don't want to do that. We want to keep this as a smart layer because we may want to add a few textures and things like that, but further down the line we might think, well, I'd like to go back in and adjust the raw settings on that image at a later date. So how do we clone? If we can't sample the pixels in this, how do we clone? So what we do is we create a blank layer above it, and what we say when we're actually in the clone stamp tool, you'll look up here, there's actually some options here. And normally it's set to current layer because you're cloning on a specific layer. But what we want to do is we want to be able to clone this layer here. We want to take some of the data from this layer and we want to be able to clone it. Now, we can choose current and below because it's just the image below, or we can say all layers. In this case, we'll say all layers. So what's going to happen is when I start to use the clone tool on this blank layer, it's going to pick up data from the layers below. So if we now do the same thing here, if we click on there and start to sample, you'll see that we're now sampling there. Now we're not actually doing this on the smart object, we're doing it on the clone layer here. Let's call that clone. And if we switch that layer on and off, you'll see that's what happens just here. Watch there, off, on. So, which means we can go back into this smart object at a later point if we decide. Let's say, for instance, we want to take off that vignette. Let's go back in there and let's just move it down, make it a darker vignette. Oops, got to select it, sorry. Make that vignette darker rather than lighter. Click OK. And there we are, it's applied that to the layer. So you've just got to be aware that there are certain things you can't do on a smart object, and so you to find other ways of doing it. And we do that by adding layers, and in this case we've used a clone layer. We can still do things like use saturation layers, adjustment layers. We can do all the normal things we do when we're editing images. We still get these adjustment layers, but we've still got the option to go back in, and we're going to do the adjustment again. This time we're going to pop it back up. Oh, used contrast, didn't mean to do that. We just pop that up to a brightness area, and we're going to do that. So you see the power of using a smart object when you're building up layers, particularly if you're applying textures and things like that. So we're just going to take off that hue saturation layer. We'll leave the clone layer on to remind you what to do. Now, another reason we should use smart objects when we're actually building composites is if we open up this image here, this is just a basic 10 by 10 image. And often what you may be doing with composites is you're pulling images in from other sources and things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull this image in here, which is the smart object image, into this document. And what we're going to do is Control T to bring it down, and we're going to resize it down. Now, because the smart object contains all the data of the image, if I resize this image, whether I resize it up or I resize it down, it's going to keep all that data, and it's going to allow me to resize it, and I won't lose any resolution. So that's with a smart object. So I can size this up as many times as I like. I can size it down here, and I can say OK. And then I can resize it, pulling it up, and I won't ever lose any resolution on this image because it's a smart object and it just contains data. Remember, it doesn't contain pixels. So we can click OK, and we're fine. We're going to put that image. We're going to use this image in another video about content aware fills, so you'll see how we can do that. So that's the smart object in there. So this one is the flat layer, and what we're going to do is we're going to drag that into the image. Now this image, which isn't a smart object, is all pixels. So if I size those pixels up and down like this, if I click there like that, what happens when I resize it up is I'm going to lose image data. Now what will happen is Photoshop will resize it for me. It'll use a formula to resize it, but what it'll start to do is it'll interpolate the pixels where it was smaller, it's resized it down, and now it's going to resize it up. Now it might not look much different. Excuse me. It might not look much different when we zoom in, but I'll show you the effect of that once we do it again. So let's resize that up. So let's resize that down again and click OK. Click there. Now let's zoom in and let's do a resize up, and let's see if we can see that effect of that pixelation. So we'll bring it up, and there, can you see it? And if we bring it up, I'm going to show you. There you can see the pixelation appearing around the edge of the image there. And that's because Photoshop is trying its best to resize it. And it'll do a pretty decent job, but it can have the effect of ruining an image if you're not careful. And it's more obvious in some images. In this one, probably not so bad because it's a fairly soft image anyway. And you might zoom in and think, oh, that's perfectly fine, that's acceptable, I quite like that. But you have actually reduced the resolution of the image. So that's why we should use smart objects to bring an image in, rather than, if I show you exactly the same on this image. Sorry, I'm on the wrong layer there. I'll show you on this one. If we zoom in on this, and then resize this down and up, let's just resize it right down and save it. And then we're going to resize it up, and you shouldn't see any pixelation. There you go. There's no pixelation on that whatsoever. Click OK. So that's the result of using a smart object. And of course, while we're in there and it's a smart object, while we've got it in as a smart object, we can still go in and we can change the settings within the file. Okay, so that's why you should use a smart object in your composites. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to pop that away again, and we're just going to work on this bigger file, and we're going to talk a little bit about how you use and bring in your textures. And the first thing I think most people might do when they first start playing with textures is they'll go to open a file and they'll pick a texture. Okay, and they'll probably, I'm not saying this is always, it's a way to do it, they'll drag and drop the image over the file. And that's fine if you've got quite a large image. You can drag and drop, you can resize it, but remember this is going to be a pixelated file, so if we resize it, it's going to be resampled by Photoshop's going to resample it. And if you've got some nice large texture files, that's fine. You can probably get away with it. Let's pop it on as a soft light. But the best way to apply a texture, let's click that off. We'll take the clone off as well. We don't need to worry about that. The best way to apply texture, there's two other ways to apply texture. We can place embedded or place linked. And there's a subtle difference between these two. If we use place embedded, it goes off, we pick up our texture and we place it, and it places it directly into the image. And it places it as a smart object. So we can resize this up and click OK, and you'll see it's placed it in here as a smart object. Now that is now embedded into the file, into our file that we're creating here. So if I make any changes to the original file, then it won't affect any of these. It's actually now part of the file. So that's what it means by embedding. It means it's embedding it into the image that I've got here. Now, if I use place linked, what that does is we go and open the file again. Let's open Lightstorm 2, and it does the same as embedded. And you'll see here, let's resize it into here over the image. And instead of getting the little smart object thumbnail, we now get a little linked smart object thumbnail. It's got a little link sign on it there. Now, what we've done there is we've actually linked this image to the file. So if at a later point I actually change that image, let's just pop that on as a soft overlay, soft light. If at some point in the future I decide I want to change that image. Now let's look at it from a point of view, say, of a graphic designer using something like building a logo in Illustrator or something like that. If I've got a document that's got 30 pages in it and there's a logo on every page, then it's nonsensical to have to go into every page and change the logo. So by linking that logo as a file within the document, the minute I change my, I'm going to open this for you, show you in real time. The minute I change my source file and then go and open the larger document, it will automatically update all the instances of that particular file in the document. So from a point of view of graphic design, building brochures and things like that, linking files is a very important element. So we're just going to change this file so you can see what happens. So if I now go and change this file and say hue saturation, and let's put it into a green so we can see it happen. And now I'm going to save it. Now, you normally do a save as with things like this, but I'm just going to save this. It's just a demo file that I use for this sort of thing. So I'm going to click save. And what will happen is, once it's saved that file, you'll see it's now changed the source file in there. So don't use linked unless you know you want to link files specifically, and it won't link them. It will only update the files when I then go back and open the files. So be careful of using linked files if you don't want to make changes in the images and then be surprised about it. So that's the difference between linked and embedded files. And you'll see on here we've got the linked file and we've got the normal smart object file. Now, what can happen? Let's just close that and we'll just take this. Now, because you've got a little smart object here, if we double click on that, it will update the texture file. It will open the texture file. And if I make changes here, it will be reflected in the image file. If we go to hue saturation and so on and so forth, change that. Now, but what it will do then is it will ask me, do I want to save those changes? So I am then doing the same as I would do in a linked file. It's going to update that. So I might not want to necessarily change that file, that source file. So I'm going to say no here. So the best way to change the colouring in an embedded file is to do it from either a hue saturation adjustment layer, do that directly like that, and clip it to the layer below, which will allow us just to change the Lightstorm file, or we can just click on, make sure we clicked on the thumbnail for that layer and go to edit image and adjustments, hue saturation. And then what will happen is it will create a smart filter here for me to enable me to change the hue saturation back and adjust it. So Photoshop works quite intelligently when you start using smart filters. It's a nice way to sort of structure your workflow and make everything non-destructive. So that's that for that video. Thank you. Bye bye.